In Alscatane, Spain, December 2nd, 1753, a young Francisco Javier de Balmis was born to one Antonio Balmis and Luisa Bergerno. His father was a barber, but not just any barber, he was a surgeon barber. Back in the days of old, a barber was not just responsible for the cutting of hair, but every part of the body that needed removal. These surgeon barbers were important aspects of the time's medical practices. Seeing his father perform these surgeries, Francisco Balmis decided that he wanted to follow in step and become a surgeon barber as well. To achieve this goal, Balmis enrolled in the military hospital of El Spain at age 17. There he studied for 5 years. Feeling well learned after his 5 years, he enrolled to work at the military hospital in Algiers to help the wounded in the recently started Spanish-Algerian War. After 2 years of service, Balmis's dreams came true when in 1778 he was permitted to perform surgery. His work was good, and on the 8th of April, 1781, he was promoted to a surgeon. With this promotion, he went on a tour of the New World with General Captain of the Royal Navy, Don José de Solano y Bote Carso y Diaz. Here in the New World, in New Spain, Balmis had his first experience with smallpox. Though not often thought about in our modern day, smallpox was one of humanity's greatest enemies. The disease has been a part of our history for a minimum of 3,000 years, with smallpox pustules found on Pharaoh Ramses V. The disease caused huge pus-filled sores to appear all over one's body. 30% of cases ended with death, and smallpox likely killed over 1 billion people, with 300 million to half a billion in the 20th century alone. This millenniums-long killer was especially dangerous in the New World, where there was no natural tolerances built up to the disease. But humanity would not stay defeated by this evil, and we eventually built our first weapon against it. In 1786, Balmis became a senior surgeon at the Hospital Militar de Alma de Dios in Mexico City, while also achieving a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Mexico. In 1790, he was promoted to director of the Galatian room at the Hospital Militar de Alma de Dios. In 1794, he was further promoted to Consulate of Surgery of the Army, and in 1795, he was promoted to Chamber Surgeon. In 1798, he achieved yet another bachelor, that of medicine, at the University of Toledo. All of these accolades permitted his attempts to find a cure for smallpox using the tools of the New World. Though he never achieved that goal, he did find ways of helping patients suffering from leprosy, along with medicinal uses for agave and begone. So imagine his delight when he, shortly after arriving back in Spain, heard of a new form of medicine called a vaccine. After hearing the news, he made a decision with himself. Balmis decided, no matter the cost, he would bring this miracle cure to the New World, where he had first-handedly seen this damage smallpox brings. The New World that he had spent over a quarter of his life in. The New World he had become so academically acclaimed in. He would bring back this medicine in the first ever international healthcare expedition. The first order of business was finding the funds. Luckily for Balmis, he had been working as physician for the King of Spain, Charles IV. Balmis approached the king about funding an expedition, and Charles, who had lost his daughter to smallpox, decided to throw his weight behind the project and get it off the ground. This trip would not be easy. The biggest issue Balmis faced was how to get the vaccine to the Americas. The vaccine needed live cowpox collected, and without refrigeration, it had to come directly from a sore. Once in the colonies, they could use locals, but the issue was, even if they took a sick person with them, they would either be dead or better before they reached their first destination. They would need to take multiple people to slowly infect on the way down. In addition, the older you are, the higher the chances you would face ill effects. That meant that they would need to take about 20 children to slowly infect on the trip, and no parent would ever agree to let their child go. And that is when Balmis figured out the plan. If no parents would let their children go, then he would take orphans. Balmis's use of orphans has led to quite some controversy, but I would like to bring in some historical context. Being an orphan back in the days of old was not a fun experience. When thinking of how orphans were treated in that time period, people often like to think of Oliver Twist. and this would be a poor comparison. Modern research shows they were actually in much worse condition. In exchange for their services, the orphans would receive a free vaccination, a surplus of food for the entire trip, a family and education assured for them in the colonies, king's orders. When compared to what they were coming from versus what they would end up with, carrying the relatively harmless disease of cowpox seemed like a fair trade. With the orphan situation squared away, he was ready to embark. His plan? Sail down from Spain to Puerto Rico, where the orphans would be able to provide the cowpox pus, up to Cuba with the local cowpox pus in hand, and then Mexico, where he would, instead of returning the way he came, circumnavigate the globe to go around to the Philippines before heading back to Spain. The trip would be made possible by a crew of 22 orphan boys, 3 male nurses, 2 assistants, 2 first aid practitioners, a rectress, and Balmis himself. In addition to the normal things needed for such a trip, Balmis brought 2,000 vials for storing cowpox pus, 500 copies of Morey de la Sarthé's works translated by Balmis himself, 6 blank books to catalog everything which happened, and a mnemonic machine. All of the preparations out of the way, he and his crew were ready to set sail. Although not listed on the initial list, the Canary Islands being owned by Spain and already on the way, Balmis decided to make a stop. As this was the first stop of the trip, Balmis was quite nervous, but his fears were quickly put to rest as the island's authorities were supportive of his plans and helped him deliver the vaccine, and he was even able to deliver some of the books to help them be able to vaccinate once he had left. This filled the team with hope for the upcoming voyage. However, that hope would soon be squashed. The team met their first source of conflict on Puerto Rico, the first true stop of the trip. The island had already received vaccine from the Danish colony of St. Thomas. This led to the governor to be quite skeptical of Balmis's team, and they were not allowed to perform any vaccinations and had to leave. This meant that they were unable to procure any new cowpox pus, so running dangerously low, they were forced to make an emergency stop. Making an emergency landing in Puerto Cabello, they had 1 sore left on the last unvaccinated child. With a Hail Mary, they performed a vaccination with the last sore. Amazingly, the vaccination held and they were able to collect more cowpox pus. After collecting the pus, they went to the capital to set up shop. While in Caracas, they met with the governor, who liked what they were doing, so much that he went and showed the captain general, who trained his regiments with the dispersal of the vaccine. After 2 months in Venezuela, they were forced to make a choice. There was a major outbreak down south in Santa Firo which desperately needed their attention. The issue was Santa Firo was the opposite direction of which they were heading. They eventually chose to split the team, with Balmis embarking to stay the course. Cuba was a quick trip for Balmis. After arriving in Havana, he found that the vaccine had already been distributed, so after comparing notes with the head doctor, Balmis left for Mexico. Balmis was in Mexico for 2 months. At first he was welcomed by the governor when he arrived in Sosala. He moved north, traveling inland to spread the vaccine. Despite the initial reception, by the time he had reached Mexico City, his relations with the authorities began to sour. He decided to split the team again. Some would stay in Mexico and continue to spread the vaccine, whereas the rest would go to the Philippines. Balmis collected 25 more orphans for the Pacific crossing and set sail. The initial reception in the Philippines was mixed. The church was all for the vaccine, whereas the governor was against it. They eventually solved the issue by having the church apply religious pressure to the governor to publicly vaccinate his 5 children. After this show, the people were won over, and the campaign provided a wild success lasting 5 months. With the Philippines being the last location, he began his journey back home. After falling ill, Balmis decided to make a stop in Macau, where he set up some vaccinations with support of the governor. It was so successful that it began to spread to mainland China. Ultimately, however, this was just a quick stop while Balmis recovered, and he was quickly back on his way. On his way home, he found himself passing St. Helena, a British colony. Now Balmis was a proud Spaniard, and Spain was currently at war with Britain. But in a move against tribalism and towards humanism, he offered to help with vaccinations on the island despite the war situation. This was ultimately the last stop of the Balmis expedition, as he arrived in Spain later that year after 3 years of travel. But what was the point of it all? Was the trip useful? Balmis and his team were able to vaccinate 20,000 people in Venezuela during the first 2 months, and after the split, the South American team was able to vaccinate a further 200,000 people. In Mexico, his teams were able to vaccinate 100,000 people, and after arriving in the Philippines, Balmis was able to vaccinate 200,000 people. In addition to vaccinating over 300,000 people in a time before refrigeration, they taught the locals how to continue the practice once they were gone. Balmis even put away tribalistic nationalism to help the enemy and teach them how to vaccinate themselves. I believe that the effectiveness of the campaign, along with the humanism at display, given that he single-handedly orchestrated the world's first international healthcare expedition, Francisco Balmis is an underlooked and underappreciated person in medical history.